Hey, welcome all you wiretappers out there. I'm back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. I have a interesting guest today, a former or retired FBI agent named Jerry Hester. Jerry, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having
Now,
me, Gary.
he's got a book, Mafia Miami, FBI Politics, and How an Investigation Was Nearly Sabotaged. Messed that one up, but you guys know what I mean. I'm going to read just a little bit. Our friend Larry Henry, I know a lot of you guys that are on the Gangland Wire podcast group on Facebook know Larry Henry. And by the way, Larry Henry and I and Tommy Canali are all going to be in Las Vegas June the 1st for the Mob Summit. So if you're all interested in going out there, I would suggest that you try to check and see if you can still get a ticket. Larry says retired FBI agent Jerry Hester's riveting account of the investigation into a high priority Italian mafioso living in South Florida takes readers inside the international operation. This book is a fascinating look at organized crime and how authorities work to shut it down. Jerry, that's so interesting to me. Not only the mafia politics, but this international aspect that what you ran into. I understand working locally on the local family, and you know who's who, and when they're meeting with somebody, who they are, but they're always there. But all of a sudden, your guy is in Florida, and then he disappears and goes to Italy, or he comes from Italy. And you don't know what his background is. So, how did you first? I guess really tell us a little bit about your career and then how you got into this case.
Thanks, Gary. You mentioned Larry Henry there. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that an old friend of both of ours, I think, is Jack Garcia, the
Yeah.
well-known FBI undercover agent. Jack and I worked together closely early in my career. I learned a lot from him. So I always like to give Jack a shout out. He helped me
Yeah.
launch my FBI undercover career as a case agent. So I began my career in San Francisco FBI and served a couple of years there, was transferred to Miami. So I did a bulk of my career, last 19 years in Miami. I always took an interest in organized crime, and lucky for me, that's where I landed. So a lot of my career spent was working organized crime as well as public corruption. But to the point with this investigation, the Miami FBI became aware of Roberto Settineri through the Italian National Police, who we had a close working relationship with. The INP had intelligence on Settineri, the fact that he was a well-known mafioso operating from Sicily and now operating in Miami. So that's how we initially found out about Centinari. But one of the interesting things that developed in that investigation, which is where you were going with it, was once we identified Centinari here and located him where he was living in the United States, in Miami, it was really amazing to me, his connections with the Cosa Nostra, with the families here in the U.S. That was something that, at least in my experience, we hadn't seen a lot of. The close relationship these guys just seemed to in the past kind of avoid each other and had their little battles a lot of times. But Centinari, melded in very well with some of the Gambino figures. So that was an interesting start for this investigation.
So working with the Italian National Police, now how did that work? They contacted you through the Legat in Rome, or did they call you directly? I'm curious how that would work. You got a little bit of a
E-
language barrier and a
Exactly.
communications barrier. So they don't know, they can't just call Miami and ask for the FBI. And so how did that work?
No, that good question. Yeah, we had established communication with the INP through our legat in Rome. So that's how we received the intelligence initially. And it really was very just a paragraph, basically, that Roberto Settineri, member of the Sicilian mafia, connected to high levels within Palermo and Italy, was operating and living in Miami and gave us a name, date of birth. And initially, that was how we found out about Settineri. Now, eventually, the Italians provided, well, let me step back. When they provided that bit of information, as an agent, you're looking at that and you're saying, well, there's a million bad guys around. I mean, is
Yeah.
this all I have to go on? This is nothing. They immediately provided troves of intelligence outlining his connections to the Sicilian mafia, particular specific individuals that he was connected with, his background. So that just, set things off for us here in the United States once we initiated an investigation. Now, that being said, just because you have an Italian mobster in your backyard, that's not against the law. That's to establish probable cause that he's committing criminal activity in the United States. So that's how the investigation began, with lots of help from the Italians initially getting it started. So that was, big shout out to them for their help early on in the investigation.
Really, and to develop what you developed out of that really minuscule amount of information. Now, guys, somebody tells you, okay, here's a mafia guy who's you don't know, you have no background on, and he's in your city, and you go out initially and you take a look at his house. Well, he has a nice house. He has kind of a nice car. He doesn't seem to do anything. You could sit there all day long and nothing would happen. What is he doing? You have no idea what he's doing. And he's a low profile kind of a guy anyhow. He's not real flamboyant. He's not out there meeting with other mobsters in the city. Your other intelligence guys are picking up. So how do you go from there? Because I know that's tough. Well, that's what the FBI here, they'd come to us and then we put manpower on the guy because he's doing something wrong. We know he's doing something wrong. We just got to figure
Right.
out what it is, get his trash, do something. How did you
Absolutely.
get into him from there? Because I know it's difficult.
It was very difficult because it was funny because I was kind of going against the grain in developing an investigation when I started working the Centinari case, because of the point you're going to, is that I didn't have an informant into Centinari. All I had was this information on him that he was a mafioso operating and living in our own backyard. So I kind of broke my own rule, and that is starting an investigation without an informant. But because we knew that Centinari was a high level connected Sicilian mafia member, it was worth the effort. But it was very difficult. And early in the investigation, because I did have a good cadre of informants already developed, I was able to reach out to a few of them and eventually make a connection and establish a probable cause on Centinari. In other words, we found out what he was doing early on to establish that PC. We found he was initially operating, being a part of boiler rooms in South Florida, which, as you know, those are businesses that use the high pressure sales tactics, unethical sales tactics. And Settineri was getting a kickback on that. We discovered that he was also extorting some businesses. Specifically, he was going to restaurants. We know one in particular that he was going to, and he would sit down, have his meal. And then the next thing you know, the owner's casually walking up to him, handing an envelope with some cash in it. I mean, who does that? We knew what that
Yeah.
was. So that was how we initially established the fact that, okay, this guy is a real mobster. He's doing mobster type things, which gave us the basis to start the investigation.
Now you had this informant. I believe was it Leo? Was that what you call him in the book?
Right.
Would you just run him in on him? Just say, here's this guy, and here's where you might find him. Now, how did that work? I did that once.
Yeah.
I just said, just go down there and start hanging out, and he
Uh,
found out a little bit of stuff. So how did he do that?
exactly. And you're narrowing in on the specific parts of the case that were difficult, because that was very difficult. At that time, I thought our chance of success was really low.
Yeah,
So basically what we were doing was doing a cold bump against
yeah,
Centenary with someone. The reason why we chose this particular individual, I call him Leo in the book, was because he hadn't met him before. So Leo
yeah.
knew Centenary, he had met him, but Centenary didn't remember him. But he was able to start a conversation and remind him, hey, we met here and there. But I coached the informant early on how to be as casual as possible. Don't be too direct. Again, at the time, I thought this is not going to work. Just no, he's too smart for that. But eventually, we were able to get an informant into him and find out who Centenary's inner circle was, some of the activity he was involved with, such as the boiler room and going to these Italian restaurants and receiving kickbacks. Another thing that early on that helped us with the probable cause was we ran a telephonic search of Centenary's phones. And that's when the flow chart around Centenary blew up to the point that we knew, hey, we're on to something here. He was talking to every other high-level mafia guy in New York and Miami and Italy. He was talking with celebrities in Miami and New York, professional athletes. He was running in some pretty high circles. And of course, with tons of low-level gangsters throughout Miami and New York that he was conversing with literally on a daily basis. So it was a flow chart like none other that I had ever seen before with an individual target. So once that was established, we had all our intel, we knew like, wow, we're onto something here. So that's when, as I like to describe, the investigation went to the next level, really.
Yeah, you would be amping it up there. Now, was there? You've got a little bit of extortion. You've got this boiler room. Was there other kinds of crimes that you thought? What did Leo use as an entree to get in to get some criminal talk, some dirty talk, if you will, to kind of lead this on to another level?
Yeah, and that was the thing too with Leo, even though he was a good informant, he wasn't the type of informant that had the ability to get that close to Centinari to
Oh,
the point
okay.
where we could draw out some of the other criminal activity. He was able to report on some of the boiler rooms and identify his inner circle. Once we established that, I knew that at this point we need something else here. We need to insert an undercover agent. We need to get somebody that has the ability to draw out this type of activity to get close to Setner to find out what he's really doing, because we knew he was involved with a lot more than boiler rooms and the low
Yeah,
level extortion. He was involved with some pretty heavy stuff because of the people he was hanging with and talking to. His phones, he had connections, contact with Bobby Era, who's an old time mobster. I don't know if you ever heard that name too, but his father was also a well known mobster, Patsy Era. These are high level guys. He's been around for many, many years. Jackie the Nose D'Amico out of New York. I think he spoke with Corozzo
yeah,
relatively frequently. So once we established that, we were going. We knew that Leo couldn't hang at that level, basically.
yeah.
So
Okay.
that, that's when we decided to insert the undercover agent to kind of find out what is he really doing
Yeah.
that's justifying this FBI investigation.
Yeah, that's when you got to find a guy like Jack Garcia that can come in and front himself off as a real deal mobster himself, and that's a rare talent there. I'll tell you that right now. It's a rare talent.
That is so true. And funny you mentioned Jack, because when I started this investigation, Jack had retired, I think probably a couple of years, 2 years before I
Oh
started
yeah,
the investigation. So I had a great relationship with, and obviously he would have been my number one
yeah,
choice for an undercover agent, but I wasn't able to use him. So, but the FBI, we had several very good undercover agents who were able to step in and fill the role.
yeah. Would you get Leo to introduce somebody in?
Yeah, what I did was is I got him to do an introduction, get our undercover agent. That's what it's all about, establishing the credibility.
Yeah,
So he was able to do that to give the bona fides to our undercover agent, where eventually the relationship was to the point where Setner was talking about his past life in Italy, Sicily, his involvement with drug activity, drug deals, his involvement with money laundering. So now, when I describe this is over a period of months, because as you know, when you bring in an undercover agent, it takes
yeah,
months to establish that bona fides. So up to this point, where we have the undercover agent, and you're talking, geez, 9 months or so into the investigation at this point, because at that time, the FBI's criminal program was not of the highest priority,
yeah.
because after it wasn't that long after 9/11, so
Oh
our
yeah,
resources were low. We just didn't have a lot of resources to direct to this case. It took a while before, even though the investigation was deemed a priority, before the resources matched the status of the case. So hence that's why it took so long to get to that point, because at that point I was really working the case by myself up to a certain point. So
yeah, and that's when you start bringing other agents in, and that's when we get to the second part of your title, FBI politics, and how an investigation was nearly sabotaged. And it's I was reading this; it was really interesting. I mean, I've lived this life kind of on a lower level than what you're talking about, but I've lived this life where you got something going, and you're bringing other people in, and some of them they're bitching and pissing, moaning, and they don't want to do this. And then you get somebody in there that wants to take it over, wants to somehow make it into his or see what he can get out of it because he's really ambitious. And so it's a tough place for the case agent, the lead agent, to be in for you. And so talk about that a little bit, how the politics and the procedures of the FBI, how that case developed as it got bigger and bigger, and you had to bring in other agents to help.
Yeah, early on, as I said, our resources were low. We didn't have many people available to work these types of investigations. At this time, I was new to this squad in Miami. I just transferred over to the organized crime squad in Miami, even though I'd been in the division for, at that time, probably about 8 or 9 years. I didn't know a lot of people on the squad. So I get to the squad and I start this case, and then I realize after a few months that, geez, I need some help here. My supervisor, outstanding guy, Joe Cicini, but his hands were tied as well. But when I got to the point where I knew that I had to get somebody, there was only one person available, which should have been a red flag, because everybody's right. How is this guy busy? Everybody else is busy,
Yeah.
and why is he not? So he
Yeah.
was an eager beaver to jump in. And he was just, like you said, everybody has worked with an individual like this in all walks of life and all professions. Someone who just is out for themselves, and it's not about the mission, it's about their career and what they can do and their self-esteem and things like that. So that was how I started the investigation. I had this individual who was a lot of times working against me, causing me more trouble than he was worth. Eventually, luckily for me, he eventually jumped off the case because I had his number at that point. So,
Yeah, right.
um,
If I remember right, he developed a source out of this case that had something else going that he could then spin off and have his own case going. Is that
well, almost that. What it was worse than that. It was pretty bad actually. What he did was I brought him in the investigation, introduced him to my informant Leo as we were working the Centinari case, and as I told you, with the flowchart with Settineri, the his connections in the mafia world were astounding. I think we had in the very beginning like 32 subjects initially in this case, 32 identified
wow?
subjects, Italian subjects in this case. What Donnie did was he identified one of the subjects in the case, started questioning my source without me knowing it, Leo, trying to establish his own case, because
Yeah,
at that point he realized, I'm not going to take this case. I'm not going to be the main guy in this case. This is Jerry's
yeah,
case, and he's not going to let me take it over. By that point, I had his number. So he was kind of working on the side, which is, I know it sounds unbelievable, but it actually happened. And in the book, you'll see where I found out later, most everyone on the squad said, yeah, that sounds about right. That's kind of his MO. That's what he did. So I'm like, why didn't you guys tell me that? So I'd have to go prove it. But hey,
really.
that happens. It happens to all of us.
So you mentioned let's go back to the Gambinos. Let's go back to the organized crime aspect of this. Now you had Joseph Corozzo and Jackie D'Amico, the Gambino family. Was it his main connections up in New York? The Gambino family.
Right. Yeah. The Gambino seemed to be his main connections up in New York. There was one, before I get to New York, before I forget it, there was one individual, Frankie the Hat DiStefano, who was a former Gambino capo out of New York. He was a guy up in probably his 70s by this point, but he had been shelved. He was in Miami when we
Yeah.
started investigating Centinari, and we found out what was going on, the activity in the boiler rooms. Di Stefano was involved with that, which that was remarkable because this was early on. We identified Frankie and realized, wow, Centinari's hanging out with some pretty heavy hitters. But the word on the street was Frankie had been shelved, went from being a capo, now he's in Miami trying to make to
Yeah.
be an earner some way to reestablish himself. But when we did that telephonic search early on, we had those phone calls to, like you said, to D'Amico, to Corozzo, to Gaetano Napoli. These are all, mid-level. Well,
Mhm.
D'Amico was a higher level individual. The New York FBI was also of assistance. They gave us some information. They never told us where it came from, which we know it came from a source that they didn't identify, which is how we do things. That D'Amico was not happy with Settineri. So D'Amico had this relationship with Settineri, but he was kind of pissed at Settineri because Settineri was dealing drugs and D'Amico wasn't a big believer in that. So once we established that intelligence, I keep going back to it at this point, early in the investigation, we knew Settineri he's a player. Even though he's low profile, this guy's running
Yeah.
in some pretty heavy circles. So that was our New York connection. there was a New York agent that I worked closely with while I was working Centinari. He was working a parallel case targeting Gaetano Napoli throughout. So we kind of helped each other, but he would give me intel on what Centinari was doing when he went to New York, who he was meeting with, places he was going in New York. And I would do the same when his bad guys would come to Miami, which Napoli, Gaetano Napoli, the Gambino capital, came to South Florida, met with Settineri in a big meeting at one point in the investigation.
So you're gathering a ton of intelligence. I mean, lots of intelligence to help a lot of people. But, from gathering intelligence to making a case is sometimes can be kind of a leap. So now how do you start narrowing down on a specific crime and making a case, finding somebody you can turn and gathered some kind of evidence?
Yeah, this was a crucial point in the investigation. Once we decided to insert an FBI undercover agent, and now Settineri's right hand man was a guy by the name of Antonio Tricamo. He was also a Sicilian mafia member. He was kind of like Settineri's right hand man. He was his enforcer. He was Settineri's enforcer, and this guy was very flamboyant. He was the complete opposite of Settineri. Very outgoing, very gregarious, liked to party. Remember, this is Miami Beach. This is where Settineri's running his operations out of, flash and cash, as I call it. So he has this right hand man, Tricamo, who is very close to him. And so at this point, we decide, okay, how are we going to do this? Who are we going to target? Are we going to have the undercover agent go after Settineri, or are we going to have him go after Tricamo? So initially, we decided to go with. At first, we decided to get the undercover agent into Settineri, and we was able to obtain conversation with Settineri. The undercover agent was able to get conversation with Settineri about his background in Italy, his crimes that he was doing there, criminal activity he was doing here. So they're establishing this relationship. And it's kind of, once you get into the book, I have exact quotes from the conversations. And they're playing this cat and forth. And for those of you who are involved with law enforcement or undercover investigations or Italian organized crime investigations, you'll really appreciate the back and forth, the testing one another. Yeah. Okay. And because in Settineri's mind, I know every time he meets with our undercover agent, he's thinking, is this guy somebody who's flipped? Is this guy a cop? Is this guy a rat? Yeah. Whatever. So you're trying to, as an undercover agent, establish your persona, but yet you have to be careful in how you engage someone of Settineri's level. So that was very time consuming. And it's a very interesting part of the book, the undercover meetings that we had at one point. And this is, again, it's all to build bona fides with Settineri. We had undercover agent had a party in Miami Beach where he has, girls and boats and cars and, the high life in South Florida, because you want Settineri to think your undercover agent is a high level, wealthy individual, because that's the type of guy that the mobsters go after, right? They want to be in business with these guys, but you have to be careful in how you do that, because you can't tip your hand. And Settineri was, I describe him as really, I know it sounds corny, but a real life Tony Soprano, just the brooding, serious character, very, very intelligent, very perceptive individual who was always watching those he was meeting with and things around him. He would, if he's meeting with our undercover agent who's supposed to be a multi-millionaire living in a $5 million house in Miami Beach, you can't have your undercover agent wearing a Timex, right? You got to wear the fancy watch. Settineri would look at those things. He'd look at your shoes. So I talk about a lot of that in the book, how difficult it was to get the undercover agent into Settineri early on.
Interesting. So what kind of a case did you actually make in the end? And did the Italians make a case too on the drug end of it? Was he importing like heroin? Was he part of like the old Pizza Connection case where he was bringing heroin over from originally from Turkey maybe, and connections back down to South America and back up to the United States? Or did you really get that far into his drug dealing?
Yeah, we did initially. After a few months of relationship with our undercover agent, he actually spoke about some specific drug deals that he was involved with. He spoke of his ability to launder money and his in doing that. And at one point, this really threw us for a loop. Once we were trying to establish a deal, because the idea was to get Centinari comfortable enough to the point where they could engage in some kind of deal with Centinari to obtain evidence, right? Evidence of a crime, criminal activity,
Right.
whether it be a drug deal or money laundering. We started with money laundering because he showed an interest in that. We told him we had a need for someone to launder. I keep saying talking about our undercover agent.
Yeah.
Our undercover agent expressed a need to have someone launder his money for him. Settinari established the fact that he could do that for us. So we were to the point now where we were ready to do a deal. And then the meeting was set up in the undercover agent. And at that point, Settinari stopped receiving phone calls from our undercover agent.
Oh.
So what we found was at this point, we had a Title III going on Settinari. We were listening to his phone calls. What we discovered was engaging in a conversation with one of his Sicilian mafia associates. And I'll never forget it. He basically says to this associate, you know, that guy that I've been dealing with that I was going to do business with, I think he's a cop. And his associate says, well, Roberto, if you think he's a cop, your gut has been good to you all these years. Walk away. And that's exactly what he did. So
Wow.
it completely walked away from our undercover agent, never called him again, never took any calls from us. So at this point, this is midway through the investigation.
Oh.
And this investigation has blown up to the highest levels of the FBI headquarters. I don't want to seem like I'm sidetracking here, but just so people get an idea of the type of investigation this had become at this point, this midway through the investigation, we had a high-level CIA operative pop up in the investigation. Meeting was in Palermo, Sicily. Once we identified who this individual was, and I put this in the book, I have a whole couple pages on it. I don't want to spill the beans on here, but it just shows you the level that this investigation had gotten to. This case was being briefed at the director's level. So now we get to the point where we're ready to do a deal, Centinari, and get evidence of his involvement with criminal activity, and he walks away. So at that point, it was back to the drawing board. But in the book, I get into how difficult a time this was because, Gary, as you know, when your case is being blown up, and I wasn't the one blowing it up, it was the people around me saying, "Oh, this is the biggest thing going, and this is the number one OC organized crime case in the F." And then when this happens, you feel like you're personally responsible. So anyway, we didn't have time to fry it, so to speak. We had to establish a new direction. And I mentioned Antonio Tricamo earlier. What I did was I was able to direct another undercover agent at Tricamo, get into the right-hand man. And I know it seemed like a step back, but that's all we had at that point.
Yeah.
And we were very successful with Tricamo. We were able to get him involved, and he laundered over $1 million worth of money for our FBI undercover agent. He was involved with trafficking counterfeit cigarettes. So we were building up these charges with the idea of flipping Tricamo against Settinari, right?
Yeah.
But then in the book, you'll see I get into the detail about that. It's not as easy as it sounds. If this were a normal criminal on the street, piece of cake.
Yeah.
If you're the bad guy and I'm the FBI agent, I walk in and say, listen, I have evidence that I could put you in jail for 10 years, or you can cooperate and help me get this guy. Most people, they're going to cooperate, right? They don't want to do the 10 or 20 years. But this is the Sicilian mafia. A lot of times they don't work that way. So that was a very, stressful point in the investigation where it's like, okay, what do we do? Do we keep building up the charges on Tricamo? I even talked about developing a scenario where it would require Tricamo bringing in Settinari, but there's no guarantees on any of that. So at that point, it was a difficult point in the investigation. But I'll let you ask your question because you know how it ends, but hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, I did. I just think about that money laundering thing from a federal standpoint. That may be the cleanest, easiest way to make a case on somebody from a reverse sting viewpoint. That way you don't have to touch drugs. You don't have to get your hands dirty in any way. It's just a money transaction. And you got plenty of money. Government's got plenty of money. Those are,
right?
like a drug thing. You've got this drugs flowing around. You're getting drugs out of the property room, and you got custody of them. Then you try, you got to make it look like you're going to sell to the guy, and that's dirty business. I always hated doing that. We got involved in some of that. I hated doing that because it just everybody looks at you funny once you start getting involved in those kind of drug transactions with criminals. So that money laundering thing, that's the ideal way to take somebody like this down. I'm kind of
It
curious.
really is.
And then back to Italy. What was going on back in Italy? Were they making some cases over there?
They were actually, yeah, they were. I mentioned earlier there was a parallel case in New York. There was also a parallel case in Italy, and they were looking at approximately 20 subjects over there involved with various phases of criminal activity. Over in Italy, just being an associate of an organized crime group, that's a
Yeah.
crime in of itself. So those folks over there were involved with extortion and connection to organized crime and all types of criminal activity. So they were working their own case there as well. And periodically throughout the investigation, I think twice I traveled to Italy to brief the Italian National Police and the Italian government on the status of the Settinari case, because this was something that they took a deep interest in, even though once the investigation started, they weren't able to really help us a whole lot over here in the United States. But we still, out of courtesy, briefed them up on status and progress in the case throughout. So I traveled to Rome for a few days, traveled at some point to Palermo, Sicily, to keep them abreast of what was going on.
Wow, it's like a movie almost. You were living with all these international and national connections, and you got this larger than life character who's like Mr.
Oh,
Big.
it was. No, you're right. And that's what the one thing, the story is. That's why I decided to write a book, because throughout the entire time I was working the case, my fellow agents, friends were telling me, man, you should write this is like a movie. You should write a book.
Yeah.
I never took it seriously. But if you think about it, this case has Italian mafia. It has Gambinos. It has, a Miami Beach setting, the
Yeah.
flash and cash.
Yeah.
And I haven't gotten to this yet, but it has a Ponzi scheming celebrity attorney from Fort Lauderdale that became an integral part of the case. And of course, you have the high level CIA operative who pops up in the case too. And there's a lot more involved with that part of it. The CIA operative, I wish I could discuss. That would be very interesting, but I obviously sworn to secrecy on that. It's all classified. And anyway, while we're on that topic about the book itself, I also threw out a couple things that we haven't discussed. I provide, and didn't do this by design. It was actually reflected back to me on people who assessed the book. I provide a tutorial on how to develop and operate an FBI investigation, because I go through the intimate details of that and
Yeah.
how to effectively operate informants. So you get all of that into one package with this book. The one thing too, you kind of touched on it with the politics, is I also talk about some of the culture change that was occurring within the FBI at the time, some policies, specific policies that had been established at that time that really changed how the FBI operated at that time. And in my opinion, and many other agents will say not for the better, those policies didn't make us a better agency. And I state those in a more of a matter of fact way in the book.
Mhm.
I'm not bashing it. It was more matter of fact from the point of view of a street agent of what was happening. And I give you examples of my case when things were occurring, roadblocks. Looking back, I know what it was. So I talk about that in the book. And the reason I did this is because it's kind of, it will give, I think, the reader an idea of when you look at see the news this day and you see some of the mishaps the FBI has been involved with.
Yeah.
People are probably saying, how can that happen? If you read this book and you look into this culture change and policy change, you might get a better understanding of how those things were able to happen. So anyway, I know I
Interesting.
got off track there a little bit from the
That's all
investigation,
right.
but that is all wrapped up into one in the book.
That's all part of the book. And it's part of what's interesting about your book and about your life and about law enforcement in general. I know I read something recently about after 9/11, you had this huge, that's part of what you're talking about after 9/11, this huge cultural shift in the way they approach things. And they went into doing stings a lot. And you had agents out here trying to do stings, and then they would, pretty soon, is it entrapment, or is it is this guy a real criminal, or you got egos at play and people wanting to make big cases. So I understand. So this is folks, this is a great book on all those different subjects, plus a good dose of organized crime, clear up the Gambinos in New York City, the Mafia Miami, FBI politics, and how an investigation was nearly sabotaged by Jerry Hester. And Jerry, I really appreciate you coming on and telling us about this book.
Thank you so much, Gary. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
Well, guys, I like to ride motorcycles. So if you're out there on the street, watch out for motorcycles. And if you have a problem with PTSD and you've been in the service, be sure and go to the VA website and get that hotline number. And hand in hand with that PSD comes drug and alcohol addiction. Well, we just talked about a Gambino and a Gambino connection to Florida. Well, there's Anthony Ruggiano, former Gambino soldier that's a drug and alcohol counselor down there in Florida. Jerry, can you believe that? He's got a hotline on his website and his Facebook page, or his YouTube page. So if you got a problem with drugs or alcohol, get hold of Anthony Ruggiano. I think that would be a great story. Let me know if you ever do that. And so anyhow, well, thanks a lot, Jerry. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it, Gary.
All right. Don't forget, guys, like and subscribe.